Episode 6, Stepping Out the Door and My First Discoveries. I grew up slower than other children, but one day I too had to leave my mother's arms. It was my first day of preschool. The road to school was red dirt, slippery from the rain the night before. My mother held my hand, guiding each careful step. My feet were muddy, but my eyes kept looking up at the clouds floating gently over the mountaintops. My school was a small wooden house with a rusty tin roof, standing quietly at the edge of our village. It was the first time I had seen so many strangers. Other kids were laughing and talking loudly. I stood behind my mother, clutching her shirt, eyes wide with fear and wonder. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know anyone. I barely understood the teacher because at that time, Vietnamese was still new to me. But my mother gently patted my head, placed a cloth bag into my hands, and said, "It's okay if you just sit and listen. I'll be waiting outside." So I stepped inside. The blackboard creaked as chalk scraped across it. The air smelled of dust, wood, and damp soil. I sat in silence through the entire first class, not saying a word. But inside me was a storm: fear, confusion, and unfamiliarity. It was also the first time I understood what it meant to be different. My clothes were faded, and my sandals were worn down at the heels. I carried an empty lunchbox because there was nothing at home to bring. During break time, I watched the others share snacks, laugh, and play. At one point, I turned toward the window, hoping my mother was still there. But she had left long ago. I didn't cry, but something tightened in my chest, like a small leaf being swept up by the wind, drifting into a strange new sky. From that day on, I began a different journey, a journey of learning how to adapt, a journey of stepping out of my small, fragile world and facing all the things I had never known. I had no idea then that this was only the beginning of many greater challenges waiting in my life. Episode 7, when I began to understand letters and little doors started to open. After those first fearful days, I slowly began to get used to the classroom. I no longer sat curled up in one spot. I started to listen, to look at the board, and little by little, I began to understand letters. The first letter I remember was O, round and full, just like the sun my mother used to draw for me with her finger on the dirt. My teacher wrote a row of letters on the board, slowly explaining each sound. I quietly followed along, then tried to write. My handwriting was shaky, crooked, just like my tiny hands still learning how to hold a pen. But when I finished writing my first letter, my heart beat stronger. For the first time, I felt that I could actually do something. In the days that followed, I looked forward to going to school. Whether it was sunny or raining, whether my sandals broke or not, I still held onto my cloth bag and walked to class. Every new letter, every simple math problem, it was like discovering something magical. I began to love books and notebooks, even though I had very few to call my own. One day I managed to borrow an old picture book, missing its cover, wrinkled and torn, but I held it like a treasure. At night, under the flickering flame of an oil lamp, I lay there reading each line in a tiny whisper. Every story opened a new world for me, a world of things that had never existed in this village. I began to make friends. The children who were once strangers began calling my name. Some days I was given half a biscuit, a piece of roasted sweet potato, or just a warm smile. I was still weak, still often sick, but every time I learned a new word, solved a math problem, or earned a good mark, I felt myself growing just a little more. Learning wasn't just about letters. For me, it was escape, a bridge, a tiny key opening the door that would take me beyond the red dirt roads, beyond the thatched roof, and beyond the limits I once thought I could never break through. And though the road ahead was still long, I started to believe that if I didn't give up, nothing was impossible. Episode 8, the first turning point and a sudden decision. My school days passed quietly, simple, but filled with hope. I still woke up early, put on my worn-out shirt, carried my cloth bag, and walked down the red dirt road to school. Letters, simple math problems, the kind eyes of my teachers and classmates, they all became part of my childhood. It felt like every day would continue just like that, steady, peaceful, but no. One afternoon, just as I returned home from school and hadn't even taken off my bag, I heard my father's calm but resolute voice. We've decided we're moving south. I froze. My mother was sitting by the fire, her gaze lost in the distance, as if weighing something far away. I didn't fully understand what that meant. I just knew that very soon, maybe tomorrow, everything I knew would change. My parents had decided to follow the path my aunt and uncle had taken before us. They had moved to the South years earlier and wrote back saying life was easier there. More land, more jobs, more chances for the children. My father, a quiet man with deep thoughts, had hesitated for a long time. My mother, too, though she loved this land, this thatched home, in the end, they chose to take the leap. For me, for a future they couldn't quite define, but still wanted to plant like a seed of hope. That night, I lay still listening to the soft rustle of my mother folding old clothes. My father quietly went out to the city buffalo that had worked with him for so many years. I didn't cry. But inside, something stirred, like a little root being pulled from the soil it had always known. I understood a new journey was about to begin, and the child who barely knew the world, me, would have to grow up faster than he ever imagined. Episode 9, Leaving Home, Our First Journey, South. After the day my father said, "We're moving south," the house grew quieter than ever. Everything began to be packed. My mother pulled out an old wooden chest from the corner. Inside were a few pieces of clothing, patched blankets, and faded photographs. We didn't have much, so preparing didn't take long, but each item she touched carried a piece of memory. I remember one evening, she carefully wrapped tiny bags of salt, roasted rice, and a few cold remedy tablets, like she was wrapping our entire hometown into a cloth bag. My father took our buffalo to sell. I didn't ask anything, but my chest tightened when I saw the way he looked at the animal for the last time. In the final days before leaving, neighbors came to visit. Some gave us corn, others slipped a bit of money into my mother's hand. No one cried, but their eyes said everything. Then the day came. On a foggy morning, we loaded our belongings onto an old passenger bus. The engine roared, dust swirled in the air, and I looked back one last time at the thatched roof house, the mountain behind our village, the dirt road I had walked on hundreds of times, all slowly faded away. The bus drove through many provinces, many places I had never heard of. At first, I was curious and looked out the window, but the loud engine, the smell of gasoline, the dry sun, and the endless bumpy roads soon made me dizzy. I rested my head on my mother's shoulder and drifted off. In my dreams, I was still sitting in my old classroom, holding a notebook, looking at the blackboard. But when I woke up, I found myself on a moving bus, on a long journey without a clear end. That night, we stopped at a roadside station. My parents laid down their coats for me to sleep under a seat and gave me some dry bread. I didn't ask, "When will we arrive?" Because I knew for my parents, arrival wasn't a place. It was a hope for a better life, for a different future. I didn't know what lay ahead, but from the moment the bus pulled away from our village, I understood. My life would never be the same again. Chapter 10, The First Steps on a New Land. After several days of traveling on the highway, the bus finally stopped at a small station in the sun-drenched land. I stepped off the bus. The hot air immediately hit my face, and the smell of dry earth and dust filled the air. The atmosphere was completely different from my hometown. There was no cool morning mist, no rooster crowing from the distant mountains. Only the sound of vehicles, the chatter of strangers, and a sense of unease creeping into my heart. Aunt and uncle were waiting for us. Aunt hugged my mother, tears welling up in her eyes. Uncle shook my father's hand, giving him a silent, reassuring pat on the back. They were the only family we had in this place. No farms, no familiar neighbors, no one calling my name in the familiar accent of my hometown anymore. Uncle carried the luggage on an old motorbike. I sat behind my mother, holding her tightly. The road was unfamiliar, and the houses were sparse. The landscape was completely different from where I was born. Wide fields and rolling hills replaced the high mountains I once knew. Everything was new, making me feel both scared and curious. Since my family moved to the south to start a new life but didn't yet have a permanent place to stay, we had to temporarily live in my aunt's house. Aunt and uncle had been living here for some time, and they were happy to welcome us. My aunt's house was small, simple, and not spacious, but it was full of love. The tin roof was hot and oppressive. The space was not very comfortable, but it was a place for us to stay until we found a permanent home. The first few days felt strange and uneasy. Everything was new and unfamiliar. But looking at my mother and father, I realized this was where my family had decided to start over, leaving behind our past to build a better future. Even though we were living in temporary conditions, I could see how loving aunt and uncle were. They took care of every meal, every warm blanket, and helped us ease our homesickness. During the first few days in the South, I didn't speak much. I simply observed, listened, and tried to adapt to the fast pace of life here. My mother started working as a laborer. My father found work as a construction worker. Every morning, I sat in front of the house, watching the people pass by, watching the trucks rush by. I didn't know what the future would hold for me, but I understood that, from the moment I stepped onto this unfamiliar land, I was no longer a child of the mountains. I had started a new journey, one where I had to learn how to adapt and grow on my own. In this new land, not my hometown, but a place that could become home, if I was strong enough.